Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Centre for Geopolitics event. Thank you all very much for joining us for today's panel discussion, Unions and Disunions in a Globalising World. My name's Jack Liddell. I'm a PhD student and research assistant here at the Centre, and I'm delighted to moderate this event. Hopefully our panellists will be able to turn on their cameras now so you can see their lovely faces. And today's discussion is going to take us across various different geographies and historical contexts. In an era which has seen the intensification of globalisation, questions are regularly being raised by policymakers as well as scholars around territorial cohesion, national identities, and also the very nature of constitutional unions. Whether it's kind of long-standing federations to contested constitutional arrangements, the idea of unity that we're going to look at today, what sustains it, what undermines it, how it evolves, has never really been more complex or more urgent to explore. And so today's discussion will have us hear about the case of Germany, where Dr. Caroline Rowe will explore the legacy of territorial unification and contemporary federal cohesion. We're also looking at the case of Northern Ireland, where Dr. Lisa Clare Whitten will unpack the internal dynamics of unionism in the wake of Brexit. And then early modern Spain, where Dr. Barnabas Sabo will examine Catalonia by looking at commerce and constitutional arrangements. After we've heard from each speaker as well, I'll open the floor for discussion and questions. Our audience should be able to submit questions through a Q&A function, and I'll then direct those questions to our panellists. But first, we'll begin with our panellists. Now, I've asked each panelist to kind of give a brief introduction about themselves, their institution, and their project before taking us through their presentations. And first, I'm delighted to hand over to Caroline.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me with you this evening. Thanks, Jack. So my name is Caroline Rowe, and I am a co-director of something called the Aston Centre for Europe, which is a research centre at Aston University in Birmingham. I do work on contemporary European policies in different contexts, and I'm currently working on a project funded by the German government, which looks at British-German relations. So the issues around unions and constitutions, where there is comparability across those contexts, are particularly relevant for my current research project.
Fantastic. And then if you want to share your screen, Caroline, hopefully it will work. We did test it out earlier and it came up. So fingers crossed.
With a bit of luck, you can see that. I'll leave that one up for a bit and then I'll come to some context on that. So am I good to go?
Good to go.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And thanks for inviting me, Barnabas. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to join the conversation today around the theme of unions, unity, and disunity, obviously, for the reasons I just mentioned, but in broad terms also because this is such a relevant issue. And I think Germany in itself represents quite an interesting case within this question because having itself lived through recent unification in living memory, which saw West Germany and East Germany disappear overnight and become instead a new union of a unified Germany. There's a big story to tell here, and there are some lessons that we can draw that are immediately relevant. So I think what's perhaps less understood is that there were significant issues in the way in which this unionizing process happened in the early 1990s. And increasingly, there's a degree of reflexivity going on in Germany today. They are felt to have had legacy consequences and then are being more critically addressed than ever before. So there are different manifestations of how and to what extent the new unified Germany maybe didn't work through some of the fundamentals ahead of creating this new union. And it's continuing to have repercussions, even today, even 35 years later, but there are big question marks. So German unification in 1990 still remains this very powerful visual symbol of the end of communism, the end of German disunity after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But Germany's political system today, its economic prosperity and its social cohesion still remain far from uniform, despite unification. And instead, what we can see is a number of overlapping centrifugal tendencies. So in my presentation this evening, I just wanted to consider a number of the most significant ways in which we can see disunion within this German Union, and they're important to understand. So these fall into a number of familiar categories. Firstly, we can look at the current state of territorial disunion in the Federal Republic. And my way into this is through analysis of territorial politics in Germany, because that's something I've worked on for many years. So I can share my reflections through that lens, but that naturally leads into the discussion of federalism, territorial dispersion of authority in Germany. And that itself is obviously a reflection of both territorial unity on the one hand and diversity on the other. So if you understand the state of German federalism today, my argument is that it can help to make more sense of politics in Germany, broadly speaking. And there are lots of different ways that we can look at the territorial dynamics of German politics and party political contestation through this lens of union and disunion. So it kind of speaks to wider understandings of German society and its divisions and its various ambitions. And that essentially is then how I'm going to frame my presentation this evening. So to start off with, I'm going to reflect on this question of union and disunity in the German context, because it's inevitably bound up with the federal constitutional order and the ways in which successive generations of Germans have sought to deliver some kind of a solution to the perennial challenge of how you balance territorial unity and diversity. So to start with some historical context, but not lost, on union and disunion in German history, and crucially in German historical memory. Germany was this kind of delayed nation in the 19th century. So when it was trendy to have a nation state, Germany didn't quite manage to do it. And it's always, as a result, ever since it did become a national entity, had these kind of challenger centers of political and economic authority. There's no natural core, there's no natural centripetal force that kind of brings things together. Instead, you have this very widespread pattern of political geography and alternative control. So any attempts in Germany to create a system which will bind these kind of disparate entities together into some kind of union state need to be very carefully balanced. And it's not surprising that as a result, Germany has a very, very long history of recurring debates over the federal order and how to balance authority between different levels of government. So Germany currently, under its constitution, the way it stands today, doesn't mandate some kind of pure form of federalism, which would be characterized by clearly separated powers between the federal level and the sub-state level, which is known as the Länder level. Instead, you have this kind of hybrid, blended status, and the term unitary federal state is a label that's traditionally been used to characterize Germany's relatively unusual model of federalism. So Germany showcases how to have cooperative decision-making alongside administrative federalism, leading to a very densely interconnected political system. So it's this notion of cooperative federalism that characterizes Germany and has characterized German federalism since the end of the Second World War. And it's classically been thought of in terms of its unifying dynamics, this particular system. So you have inbuilt logics of and incentives for cooperation in themselves structured into this federal system, making it operate and function essentially like a unitary system. But you have multiple competing cooperative venues together working to achieve an overarching harmonizing effect. And that leads to standardized policy outcomes across the territory. That's the ambition. So the original modeling suits the purposes of delivering a welfare state. And this is all designed in the post-war era. So the classic aspiration of a welfare state is for policies to have this kind of uniform statewide reach. So it's the solution that was found to that diversity versus unity challenge at the time. If you are going to deliver welfare at the point of need, equal and equity of provision for all citizens, irrespective of where they live, this system was one solution. Fine. But then on the other hand, where do you put all of the tensions around diversity? So one of the classic aspirations of federal, devolved, or other forms of decentralized government is this diversity of policy provision. And the aims of that kind of system would be to reflect the distinctive preferences of different territorially demarcated communities within the state. So that tension continues then to inform the way in which we understand what German federalism has evolved to become. So the German basic law, which is effectively its constitution, suggests that through this kind of integrated multi-level process where you have extensive federal and subnational Länder level government cooperation, you can then ensure that citizens have uniform access to welfare provisions. So they call that uniform living conditions. That's what the original German constitution stressed, that this system is meant to deliver uniform living conditions. And then as a result, you have strong normative expectations in public opinion that living conditions should indeed be uniform. And if you're going to read the great bulk of academic writing on German federalism, you would be led to believe that the dynamics of this extreme model of cooperation, federalism, policy entanglement, the way it's been described, that metaphor has been quite successful in capturing these dense networks. You would think that the Länder are in fact quite restricted in their use of policy making so as to control this uniformity of policy outcomes, but more contemporary scholarship and analysis has thrown this orthodoxy into question, and that's something I've been working on in recent years, about unpacking that diversity. Because when you think about it, even at a very practical level, creating some kind of uniform living standards or conditions is going to be really challenging and really costly as well. So even back in the early 90s, shortly after German unification, the wording of the constitution had to be amended to establish a less stringent test. And that's where this notion of equivalence comes in to replace uniformity. Even at this early point in Germany's post-unification history, these questions about the state of the union and its durability were being asked. So the bottom line is that despite this emphasis on uniformity and equivalence and this constitutional notion of uniform living standards, the lived experience of federalism does vary across the territory, and different Länder will prioritize different things, primarily because of the financial situation. So I'll just show you this little graph, which you may or may not be familiar with. And it's to do with territorial cohesion and uniformity, and latterly, equivalence ambition has been a key marker of this unionizing dynamic in German society. So the big mechanism that drives the delivery of uniform living conditions is this fiscal equalization process within German federalism. So basically, this scheme ensures that each of the 16 Länder have equal financial capacity in order to deliver those policies which shore up uniform living conditions across the territory. Any remaining gaps in fiscal balance sheets are met through central government grants as well. So this system kind of acts as a unifying force, and it was meant to ensure that all of the Länder had similar financial capacity to really fulfill those responsibilities, and it's a backbone really of the whole federal system. But it's become problematic. As you can see from the graph, you end up with a system whereby a minority of the Länder are paying into the system, the green Länder, the richer, more economically successful. Those that are in red are the Länder which are receiving funds from this equalizing system, and that creates tensions in and of itself. There have been persistent calls for this to change. It also speaks to ideas on social citizenship, like T.H. Marshall wrote. How far exactly do ideas around solidarity extend within the state? Are we seeing a drive towards territorialization of social citizenship? So there are new social cleavages that have opened up in and around the numbers in this graph, particularly because with the original question of unity and union, the 6 states which joined the Federal Union in the post-communist era are primarily the 6 biggest recipients from this particular scheme. So it's definitely the West paying to shore up the East, though there are outliers, and there's a number of Western German states as well that are not paying into the scheme but receiving from it. So despite all of this normative commitment to delivering social policies on a uniform statewide basis, there are now growing challenges to those kind of prioritizations. And the resulting territorial cleavages that have opened up as well become problematic too. So where does this problematic find its expression? Well, that's where we turn then to the political consequences of these particular territorial cleavages and the notion of disunity within ostensibly a unified Germany. And the most recent federal elections have obviously given cause for concern because you've seen the rise of particularly extremist parties. So in an unstable union, it's likely then that you're going to see challenger political opportunists stepping into that space. So global events can lead to political consequences at the local level. I suppose that's one of the bigger consequences when we're thinking through political union and disunion. It's important to remember that if we're looking to understand societal cleavages that are driving this kind of notion of disunion or disharmony within the union, the original unification process in 1990 wasn't a merger of two disparate states, it was a takeover. So the western part of Germany adopted the eastern part of Germany, but then expected the eastern states to be able to implement the federal system wholesale. There was no critical engagement, whether that would suit, whether there was an alternative avenue that could have been pursued. There was no conversation meaningfully around alternative programs for government. This was simply a takeover bid of the East by the West. So it was unification, but Germany was reunited in a way it had never existed before. So that's all some kind of a myth around this union state as well. And thinking through the consequences socially of what it would have felt like to live through that takeover. If you were a middle-aged worker in the East, so you're an older voter today, let's say, think how disorienting an experience that would have been when in the early 1990s, your entire social context and your social security just disappears overnight. Everything you've understood in the world, your job security, your profession, everything just completely dissipates. So there's an understanding that this socially dislocated elements of this society never found a new way to integrate, and it's just been bewildering ever since. And some of that has gone under the radar, but is finding an expression as a result of this kind of critical analysis of why the voting patterns and voting behavior in recent times have kind of mapped onto that sense of social dislocation. So the next graph shows you, again, some of the results from the most recent federal elections at the national level. So the biggest challenger party is the Alternative for Germany, which is in the light blue color. So this is a multi-member plurality system, AMS, if you're familiar with that kind of system in Scotland or Wales, for instance. It's pretty much the same thing. This is the share of the second vote, and it pretty much maps completely onto an east-west split, though, of course, the party was very proud of its inroads in the West as well. It really speaks to all of that notion of how ineffective the social and political cohesion of this union state has really bedded in. So rapid social changes, rapid economic changes, economic hardship have all created a sense of disappointment that really has been played upon by these new extremist voices in the political system. So there hasn't been a sense that economically the east of Germany has caught up with the West. Wages are still lower, there's still outward migration, there are still fewer skilled jobs. There's evidence to support that in my next slides, which, despite being in German, show you that in leadership positions, East Germans do relatively badly in unified Germany. So in politics, only 21% of leadership positions are occupied by citizens who would be from the east of the country. In the media, even lower, down to in science. lowest numbers there. With regard to incomes, so on the left-hand side of that graph, the top line shows you sort of average incomes in West Germany versus average incomes in East Germany. There's still a massive difference. And the distribution of income is in the bar chart on the right. It's not difficult. You don't have to look hard to find statistics which evidence this notion of continued differentiation even 35 years after this unification. So are you happy with democracy? The red numbers show you just how happy you are with democracy and how unhappy you are with democracy is marked in the blue. The bluer, the more unhappy. So down at the bottom, you've got poor earning Eastern Germans are, of course, more unsatisfied with democracy, whereas the highest earning Western Germans in the top line are substantially more happy with democracy overall. I mean, these statistics all just map onto each other. This is in German as well, but it just shows you how integrated do you think Germany is today? So there's still a majority in the red zone who say that Germany is not particularly integrated. Just evidencing where this is going over the years. And of course, there have been critical reflections as to how to make sense of this, particularly because for the German national psyche, how do you make sense of a right-wing party doing so well? Sociologists, historians have all taken issue with this, and there's been a popular movement around this notion of being unequally united, which is not my term, it's the name of a book that's been written by a sociologist in Germany, trying to grapple with the rise in support for the far right on a scale that hasn't been seen since the 1930s, and trying to map that onto something substantive in recent German history. So the union ineffectiveness of this unifying force and the complete support for this right-wing narrative in the eastern part of the country. I think the experience of life as an East German has a lot of explanatory power here. People are not happy with constant change, and that's the rallying cry of the AfD that it particularly latches onto. Some of that relates to and speaks to voters' experience of the collapse of the GDR. That was disorientation, disruption was a big theme of this most recent federal election. And some of the biggest disrupting forces were seen as things that the populists would attack for the good of the common man, like geopolitical uncertainty, climate change, digitalization, all of these disrupting and unsettling forces, a time of rapid change. So the argument goes that former communist, those people who were socialized in former communist times want continuity, and they want to listen to a political party that's promising change, but in a nostalgic way. It's a kind of cry for help. Life is challenging. They're looking for more straightforward solutions in an increasingly complex world that's exhausting. Financial crisis, Euro crisis, migration. They're just looking for some simple constancy and consistent answers. And that's the kind of sociological interpretation of all of this as well. There are lots of conditions and questions around sort of authoritarianism, being socialized in an authoritarian regime as well, and possibly seeing echoes in the governance of contemporary Russia under Putin, which is kind of familiar if you've been socialized under the East German dictatorship. Ideas about how to keep society in check and under control, resonate with a population that never really fully integrated into this Western model. So to close out, and I'm sorry I've overrun, Jack, but there aren't any easy answers to all of this. The ambition to unify Germany into this sort of larger federal republic, as opposed to some kind of new political entity after the demise of communist East Germany, was morally unambiguous, but practically quite challenging. And the evidence suggests that unification is much more complex and much more multidimensional, not easy to orchestrate, even when it's underwritten by some of the world's biggest political and economic power brokers. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Carolyn. A fascinating presentation. Lots of food for thought and discussion there, I think, especially around the most recent elections and developments. But before that, and in the interest of time, we'll move swiftly on. to hear next from Lisa. So if you want to share your slides, Lisa, and take it away.
Perfect, thank you. I hope that's coming through okay. Getting some nods. Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. Real pleasure to be here. And yes, my name is Lisa Clare-Witten, as Jack said at the start, and I'm a research fellow at the School of Law in Queen's University in Belfast. I'm currently working on a project that looks at trade policy and its interaction with devolution. But I came at that from looking at all things Brexit and Northern Ireland, which is really more the basis for what I'm going to speak about this evening. And that's specifically focusing in on unionism in Northern Ireland. So an exploration of Northern Ireland unionism and its post-Brexit realities, and that's kind of euphemistic. And we're more talking about challenges, as we'll see. So starting like classic academic with definition. Just to keep it all clear, so unionism is a political ideology that supports the policy that the countries of the UK should remain together, especially that Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, in the context of Northern Ireland, and I'm sure people on the call are familiar with the history, a learned audience, this unionism has been an identity that is in opposition to nationalism, which is the policy that's in favour of a united Ireland in future. And there was, of course, a 30-year history and centuries before that of tensions and conflict between unionists and nationalists, and also loyalism and republicanism. Now, we don't have time to get into all the nuances of definitions of different communities in Northern Ireland, but this is unionism that we're looking at. And while it's specific in the Northern Ireland context, it of course has parallels with other unionist movements and ideas, and we'll maybe get to that at the very end. So what is contemporary unionism in Northern Ireland like and facing? I want to talk about three challenges: the Brexit legacy, where we'll touch on sense of a British betrayal and an Irish conspiracy. Then we'll look at changing electoral demographics and the neither nationalist rise, we'll explain in a second. And then finish up by looking at internal tensions and unionist divides, rejection competition, the demise of pacts. That will hopefully become clear in a couple of minutes. And then I will finish with, I will put my hands up and say it's not a very conclusive conclusion. It's more like a collection of observations about the future of unionism and its current position and potential future trajectories. So that's where we're heading. First, Brexit, the Brexit legacy. So the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, which is a set of specific arrangements designed to address the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland in the context of the UK withdrawing from the EU. Without going into too much detail, and I could riff all night, so that would be dangerous. But the protocol requires that some aspects of EU law continue to apply in Northern Ireland. And the sort of trade-off for that is that Northern Ireland can continue to participate, in effect, in the single market of the EU in respect of goods. And what that means is that on the island of Ireland, the winding 300-kilometre, 500-kilometre long land border between Ireland and Northern Ireland doesn't have to be enforced or physically hardened. So checks and controls don't need to take place on that land border. Instead, new checks and controls take place at the ports and airports of Northern Ireland. That's an outworking of the protocol. There are many other things that could be said about it, but the key for unionism is that this implementation of new checks and controls, new barriers to trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK was seen as an affront to the unionist identity and a threat to Northern Ireland's position within the UK. The protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland is unanimously opposed by political unionism and the unionist community in Northern Ireland. So here we have an extract of a unionist declaration on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which honestly I can't quite, oh, there we go, I can move the My own face was in front of it, but now I can read it. We, the undersigned unionist political leaders, affirm our opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol, its mechanisms, structures, and reaffirm our unalterable position that the protocol must be rejected and replaced by arrangements which fully respect Northern Ireland's position as a constituent and integral part of the United Kingdom. So that's just indicative of the strength of feeling and the unanimity, the unity within the unionist political identity in opposition to this protocol. As you can see there, that's from September 2021, and things have changed, as is the case in the Brexit world since then, which we'll come to. But as I say, here we go. Not just political unionism, and while primarily in this presentation I'm focusing on that, but among the unionist community, so the unionist electorate and population in Northern Ireland, this protocol and the implementation of it was really seen as really strongly opposed, vociferously opposed, and in a long tradition of Northern Irish political expression, the graffiti around the place reflects this. So you'll see no Irish sea border inscribed in various degrees of formality in many places since the implementation of the protocol came in at the beginning of 2021 at the end of the transition period. And here you also see, this is indicative of a wider sense that under the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who signed off on ultimately the withdrawal agreement with the EU that brought in the protocol, this sense of betrayal on the part of the UK government of the unionist concerns about Northern Ireland's position within the UK. And on the other side, one of the narratives you'll hear among unionist communities is that the protocol in itself is a sense of retributive, it's punishment for the Northern Ireland as sort of an example, and it plays into the hands of the Irish government. So in the broader history of Northern Ireland's conflict, the protocol is perceived by some in the unionist community as a win for the Irish government and as a step towards unification of the island of Ireland. So that's just a sense of to communicate the level of grievance felt by this implementation of particular arrangements for Northern Ireland within the unionist community itself. And as you can see, there's a profound sense of insecurity within this identity, and that is reflected here. So polling that we've carried out at Queen's, colleagues David Finnemore and Katie Hayward and myself, from April 2021 through to April 2025, we've consistently asked the whole population, selection of the population representative sample of Northern Ireland, how much, the extent to which they trust or distrust the UK government to act in the interests of Northern Ireland regarding the protocol, which is now the Windsor Framework, which we'll come on to in the next slide. And as you can see there, essentially, the reports aren't good for the UK government. So levels of distrust are consistently high, between 86 and 68 being the most positive result, which is good news for the current Labour administration just in the beginning of this year. There's been an improvement, but nonetheless still high distrust. And then levels of trust really rock bottom, essentially. And some of these were actually within the margin of error, those 3%. So why this is particularly important for unionism is that in Northern Ireland's electorate and society, you would expect to see very high levels of distrust of the UK government from those in the nationalist community and low levels of trust in the UK government, but you would expect to see higher levels of trust and lower levels of distrust in the UK government within the unionist community. But just the sort of broad scale and stark results here are indicative of how damaged the trust, the sort of history of trust and the what you would expect to see in terms of trust within the unionist community of the UK government has been so damaged by the Brexit story and how it unfolded for Northern Ireland. So, as I say, things have changed since the protocol came into effect. In February 2023, we had the Windsor Framework. So implementation of the protocol wasn't just controversial for the politics within Northern Ireland, but it was also a source of real tension between the UK and the EU. They, after a prolonged period of intermittent talks and a whole lot of political drama, under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in February 2023, a new settlement set of arrangements were agreed, package of measures to amend and make further provisions around the implementation of the original protocol, which was also renamed, somewhat confusingly, the Windsor Framework. And it particularly addressed issues regarding movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and also increased the amount of opportunity for Northern Ireland representatives to input into the implementation of the protocol. So the sort of takeaways for us and for the Brexit legacy in Northern Ireland is that this brought new stability to the UK-EU relationship, at which Northern Ireland is now at the centre of. It's sort of the place between the UK and the EU. So stability within that relationship is sort of good for Northern Ireland if you think of it as the centre of a Venn diagram. And it also represents agreed terms for the operation of Northern Ireland's particular arrangements, which for businesses in Northern Ireland and also the governing institutions of Northern Ireland is a positive. However, in 2022, February 2022, the DUP, the largest unionist party, had resigned from the Northern Ireland executive, thereby collapsing the government. And they, although the Windsor Framework was meant to bring them back into the executive, it took another year before the DUP would agree to come in, and they did so on the back of terms agreed between the UK government and the DUP directly under the Safeguarding the Union paper and arrangements, and it focused on UK domestic guarantees and mechanisms designed to bolster and secure the position of Northern Ireland within the UK internal market. Now, the leadership of the DUP at the time felt this was sufficient basis to enable a return to Northern Ireland devolved institutions. However, that leadership was subsequently changed in an unexpected manner. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, who was leader of the DUP, who really brought this deal in, subsequently resigned and is undergoing investigation for historical accusation of historical sexual assault and crimes and misdemeanors. That case is ongoing, but what that has meant for political unionism is that ownership of this Safeguarding the Union deal has sort of been left at the door of Geoffrey Donaldson's legacy, and there's since been a rollback within the party from the sense that this Safeguarding the Union solved the issue. So there is still a distinct sense of unhappiness and discomfort with Northern Ireland's post-Brexit arrangements for unionism. So a reneging of the support for this Safeguarding the Union. It's moderated, but it's still there. Okay. These final 2 points are quicker, so hopefully we'll not get too far over time. Brexit legacy overall, we have real insecurity, therefore, and also unwanted arrangements that are continuing to be implemented from a unionist perspective. They are not wanted. Moving on to challenge number 2, which is electoral demographics. So here you can see trends from 1998 through to 2024, and this is based on the Northern Ireland equivalent of the British Social Attitude Survey, in which consistently the question has been asked of individuals whether they identify as a unionist, a nationalist, or a neither. So there is particular interest in Northern Ireland in how individuals identify along in these 3 categories, because of the unique constitutional provision that in future, if it seems that a majority of the population of Northern Ireland want to leave the UK and become part of a united Ireland, would vote in favour of doing so, then the Secretary of State could hold a poll, and a referendum would be held on that matter. So why that matters is because in the realm of opinion polling, if there are consistent majorities that seem to indicate there would be a majority in favour of constitutional change, that holds a particular political and symbolic weight in Northern Ireland. So that's just a little bit of context around why this question matters and has particular significance in Northern Ireland. There's sort of 3 stories to tell here, as you can read yourself on the graph most likely. So we have the neither identity in yellow, has broadly increased across time, with becoming the largest since 2005, largest identity. Then you have relative stability and nationalism, from 20s to 30s, with an uptick more recently in the last number of years. And then unionism, you have a sort of slow decline of unionism across time. These three trends and three stories are reflected in electoral results, as you might expect in Northern Ireland. So for Northern Ireland Assembly results, this is from 1998 to 2022, election results by percentage of seats according to designation. So again, it's the total number of unionists identified, total number elected, total number of nationalists identified, and total number of those who identify as neither, that have been elected to sit in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Now you can see the neither representation has increased since 2017. So 2017 is when we can start to think about the effects of Brexit coming into Northern Ireland politics. It's also notable there is a clear discrepancy between the public opinion and percentage of the population who identify as neither and representation in the Assembly. We can speak more about that if it's of interest. But then we also see, again, stability and nationalism, and by contrast, a decline in unionism, such that the two are now evenly kind of equivalent to each other and have been for the last few years. So it's important not to overstate, I think, like this unionist decline. As you can see, they're still the largest group in the Assembly, or were. But nonetheless, there is this sort of steady, it's not a positive picture, particularly when you set it against the demographics and the demographic change within Northern Ireland. Okay, important caveats here to this sense of inevitable unionist decline or difficulty. The first is around the electoral system and the governing system that Northern Ireland has. So it has a mandatory power sharing system, which in effect acts as a safeguard for, in this case, political unionism. The same could be said on political nationalism in the face of declining electoral support. So this is an extract from the Northern Ireland Act, which is the sort of constitutional text that defines how the government works. And as you can see there, the largest political party of the largest political designation gets to nominate someone to be First Minister. So it's not the largest outright political party, it's the largest political party from the largest designation, which is either unionist, nationalist, or neither. And then the largest political party from the second largest political designation gets to nominate who will be Deputy First Minister. So it's a little bit institutional in process, but what this means is that even if there are splits within unionism, if there is retains either the largest designation or the second largest designation, it will still be able to nominate, there will be a unionist first or Deputy First Minister. So hopefully that makes sense. There is also a lot of talk, and particularly in the view of the instability and perpetual instability of Northern Ireland's institutions, their propensity to collapse. There's been a lot of recent discussion around reforming the institutions, including some changes to the designation system and the system for appointing ministers. Now, they include changes such as moving to a voluntary coalition, changing the system for appointing First and Deputy First Minister, but moving to a voluntary coalition which would prevent one party from collapsing the institutions so easily, and also revising the designation system to recognise the validity of neither's votes in certain circumstances within the Assembly's functioning. What's key here is that in the context of discussions around reform, as has been the case since 1998, and where changes are being made to Northern Ireland's institutions, generally those changes come based on multi-party consensus, which is hard won. And the NIO relatively recently made that clear to say that if there would be any changes, they would have to have cross-community consent, which is to say that if changes were being made, unionists would be in the room as well as nationalists and neithers. So all of this sort of acts as a break on what we could otherwise see in some of those trends of unionism in decline. It's under challenge and pressure, but nothing is inevitable in Northern Ireland politics, at least not at this point. But this does lead to a final point around internal unionist divisions. So because of that electoral system and because of just the history of intercommunal tensions within Northern Ireland, electoral pacts is something that has been quite a feature of the electoral system and elections. But more recently, there's been somewhat of a move away from internal unionist pacts. So in 2015, there was essentially an electoral pact between the DUP and the UUP, where parties, one or other of the parties stepped down in certain constituencies to give to the other party more of a chance of winning a seat, so to avoid splitting the unionist support base. However, in view of particularly since Brexit, etc., and internal tensions and sort of disagreement between the unionist representatives about how Brexit was being handled, particularly the DUP, because they had a particular role throughout the process. So they faced a lot of criticism from, on the one hand, the UUP, and on the other hand, the TUV and the other unionist parties. So there was a rejection of a pact in the Assembly election in 2022, and again in 2024. The DUP on this occasion rejected the offer of a pact with the TUV and also the UUP. So an effort to form a pan-unionist party, but those sorts of deals are not really working in more contemporary Northern Ireland politics. So again, it's demonstrating the internal tensions that makes it harder to hold a cohesive unionist identity across the board. And this played out in the most recent electoral event we've had in the general election in 2024. So particularly for the DUP, which is the largest political party of Northern Ireland. And therefore, currently the Deputy First Minister is from the DUP. So in the 2024 elections, the DUP lost 3 seats. It was a bad election for them, but they, notably in this context, they lost seats to 3 different parties of very different persuasions. So the Alliance Party identifies as neither. It's a kind of cross-community party. They lost to them in Lagan Valley. The UUP would identify as a more moderate unionist party, slightly more centrist than the DUP. They lost to them in South Antrim. And the TUV is a more extreme, more right-wing version of unionism, and the DUP lost to TUV in North Antrim. So you can see the pressures on the largest unionist party and representation coming from all sides within the system. And again, it's indicative of the internal tensions, which makes it harder to hold that cohesive unionist identity, which in the Northern Ireland institutional setting is really important for sustaining a large designation and representation. Final point before I conclude is just to look a little bit more broadly on unionist sort of branding of Northern Ireland unionists in the view of the rest of the UK. So this data is from 2020. It's a bit out of date because these questions don't always get asked in UK-wide surveys, but this is views in Great Britain on whether or not, in principle, there should or shouldn't be a border poll held on Northern Ireland's constitutional future. And as you can see in the general population, 36% said there should be a border poll, 25% said there shouldn't be a border poll. And you can see the splits there, more support among Labour and Lib Dem voters than among Conservative voters, which we would probably expect. And what's interesting, I guess, from a political unionism point of view, is that they definitely would not want a border poll to be held. And the sense of their unionist loyalty to the rest of the UK, to that union of the UK, isn't reciprocated based on this data. It doesn't seem to be reciprocated. Just similarly then, again, this is in 2020 data, and you're showing a change from 2019 to 2020. So this is sort of peak Brexit and the role of the DUP was quite prominent at this era in terms of the wider UK politics. How would you feel if Northern Ireland left the UK? You can see the broader majority wouldn't be bothered in March 2020. About a quarter would be upset even in March 2020, but you can also just see the trend of increasing apathy and sort of decreasing sense of loyalty or solidarity with Northern Ireland around this time. It would be great to get updated data on this. This is as recent as I could find, and it's just looking then at that unionist identity from a Northern Ireland perspective. What is that tie to, and what is the feeling on the other side of that union, and how much of a sense of solidarity is there? Okay, what future for the union? My inconclusive conclusion is to say that in the last few years we have seen profound unsettlement in Northern Ireland unionists and Northern Ireland unionist identity. That's been characterised by an increased distrust generally, but particularly in the UK government, as we've seen. There are electoral and demographic pressures from multiple constituencies within Northern Ireland on the unionist majority, and internal divisions, which leads to increased electoral vulnerability or volatility in terms of the results. Absent any fundamental reform of the mandatory power sharing system in Northern Ireland, of government in Northern Ireland, and this is the important caveat, it's likely that political unions representation will remain stable. And as you can see, although I'm sort of highlighting the decline and the challenges, at the same time, there's a solidity in the support for unionism. And it's also important to note that we are talking about political unionism here, and this is not necessarily linked to constitutional change, because that would be a very different question and would be held on a referendum basis. And what would be key in that context is what would the neither identity, those who identify as neither and support and vote in favour of neither representatives, what would they do in a constitutional change setting? As it stands within the institutions of Northern Ireland, the nationalist identity and unionist identity are still relatively strong and have strong support bases, albeit there are these real pressures and profound unsettlement within the identity. Linked to that, and yes, I will close up here, Jack, the post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland continue to apply, and they are a source of discomfort and frustration within unionism. But the UK-EU relationship, if that comes closer, there is a sense that that could mitigate some of that, the extreme impact on Northern Ireland unionism. And it is a resilient ideology. So while there are real challenges, it is going to continue to play a role within the UK and within Northern Ireland as part of the island of Ireland. Thank you very much, and I will stop talking there. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Another fantastic presentation. I'm sure we've all, as I have, got loads of questions. Discussing Brexit always gets us going, so I'm looking forward to the discussion there. But first, let's move to Barnabas to round off our discussions, taking us back in time now to early modern Catalonia. A big thank you to Barnabas as well. All credit goes to him for bringing us all together for this panel. So over to you, Barnabas.
Thank you, Jack. As you said, my name is Barnabas Sabo, and I am a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Geopolitics, where I work in the UK Union program, and I'm also a historian. And the consequences of that should become evident soon. But just, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Caroline and Lisa Claire for these very insightful takes on union and disunion in these different contexts. I think what we have heard illustrates very well that, which is still not always understood as obvious, but matters of union and disunion are never simply constitutional legal matters. Back in the day, when I used to work more on the recent history of Scotland within Britain and Catalonia within Spain, and the challenges meant by their respective independence movements, I certainly learned that historical narratives are central to how dilemmas of unification and separation are discussed, and consequently how we perceive these unions and their constitutive parts. And this is why it made sense to me to return to some of the historical events that featured in these narratives, and to have a closer look at the transformation of the British and the Spanish monarchies at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. In general, and I mean this to highlight also the value of the applied history approaches that some of us have been experimenting with at the Center for Geopolitics. And also to try to paraphrase Quentin Skinner here, looking at the ways in which concepts related to union and the relative positioning of distinct polities were formulated in the past, and looking at the context in which these concepts were used in the past, could, I think, help us evaluate political alternatives in the present times, and perhaps even anticipate the paths lying ahead for these countries. Specifically in relation to the matter of union and disunion in the Spanish Catalan context, which is what I would like to address today, let me share a personal a personal anecdote, which to me underlined the importance of historical analysis in the Spanish context. A couple of months ago, a Spanish professor took the time and energy to send me an email, wholly unprovoked, I think, in which he called my research comparing Scotland and Catalonia very deficient, as, and I quote here, unlike the United Kingdom, Spain was not and is not a union. The implication being, I believe, that a union is, after all, made up of parts. Now, I let you all draw your own conclusions about the entanglements of academic research and nationalism here, but for me, and I don't mean to generalize here, but I think this attitude goes some lengths to suggest that parts of Spanish society, or perhaps even the Spanish political class or classes, could possibly approach matters related to the otherwise very real plurality of Spain in a more detached, more analytical, and perhaps more constructive way. Turning to my actual subject matter for today, plurality was often seen as a challenge by the government of the Hispanic monarchy through the 17th century as well. In the 1600s, Spain was still the vastly composite monarchy of the House of Austria, made up of many realms, the Principality of Catalonia among them, that differed in their constitutional, legal, institutional structures, and also in their relative weight inside the monarchy. Between Flanders and Gibraltar, the Italian peninsula and the American colonies, the Hispanic monarchy suffered from a certain imperial overextension, and also from an inflexible trading system, as well as the strategic, military, and financial issues that resulted from this situation. Now, in the center of the monarchy, ways of imposing a greater degree of uniformity were periodically considered to improve the efficiency of governance. One could think of the Count Duke of Olivares and the idea to extend Castilian law to the whole of the monarchy, or to formalize a defense pact between the different realms under the same sovereign. Such reforms could not be implemented at the time, but events like the revolt of the Catalans in 1640 and the subsequent decade of, actually over a decade, of French sovereignty over the Principality reminded the Habsburg governments of the dangers of plurality. Related problems were also perceived in Catalonia at the time, although from a different angle. Absentee kingship was resented for turning the resources and splendor of the royal court away from the Catalans, while occasionally also hindering the functioning of Catalonia's institutions. Additionally, as the Mediterranean trade lost some of its importance relative to the globalizing Atlantic trade of the Spanish Empire, the Catalans resented that commercial exchanges with Spanish America had to be conducted through the Andalusian ports of the monarchy. Catalonia's commercially minded elites perceived a drift towards the peripheries of the monarchy and demanded reforms to address it. One of the best known and possibly most influential Catalan promoters of such reforms was Narcís Feliu de la Peña, the heir to a wealthy Catalan merchant family and a doctor of law, who in his works written and published in the 1680s outlined a complex program that revealed a lot about how he and his like-minded provincial patriots thought about Catalonia's place within the monarchy. The commercial reforms that Feliu proposed were conceived within a typical mercantilist framework and mainly consisted in protectionist measures such as the closing of the Spanish markets to foreign, especially French competition and especially in the textile trade, and the demand for a Barcelona-based trading company that could trade between Barcelona and the Spanish-American ports directly rather than through Cadiz and Sevilla. Now, the more original part of Feliu's vision was that these commercial reforms were to be supported by a simultaneous reaffirmation of Catalonia's distinct institutional and legal system, which Feliu did not only extensively praise, but considered quintessential for securing the commercial objectives and the prosperity that those would bring to Catalonia. So Catalonia, as a part of the Hispanic monarchy, was to be set apart within that monarchy to a place of distinction, and this was to go hand in hand with increased Catalan participation in global trade under the protective umbrella of the Spanish Empire. Feliu's ideas were quite widely discussed in and out of Catalonia, including at the royal court, but a meaningful chance to advance the reform agenda came only after the death of Charles II unleashed the contest for the Spanish throne, eventually culminating in the War of the Spanish Succession. To bolster his legitimacy, King Philip, the new Bourbon ruler of Spain, convoked the parliaments of his new realms, and the Catalan courts of 1701-1702, which were the first to be concluded for over a century, converted important parts of Feliu's reform proposals into pieces of legislation that were given the royal assent. Soon the Catalan elites decided that the liberties of Catalonia and improvement to its trade would be better assured by someone whose grandfather was not Louis XIV, like that was the case with King Philip. And this prompted a shift in their loyalty from the Bourbon to the Habsburg contestant and a reconvocation of the courts, the parliament, under the authority of King Charles. This King Charles is the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. Now, this reconvocation happened in 1705, and then the king reconfirmed and indeed amplified the reforms that King Philip had also agreed to. Feliu himself was an influential observer of both parliaments. He even liaised between the Catalan estates and King Charles during the 1705-1706 courts. His last work, the three-volume Anales de Catalunya, was published in 1709 in support of the Habsburg claim to the Spanish throne. And funnily enough, it recognized the great achievements of the earlier courts while regretting that, unfortunately, the parliament concluded in 1702 was not a real parliament, because only the true king can call the courts rather than a random French prince. In the Annales, Fallou made it clear that if a choice was to be made between commerce and constitution, securing Catalonia's distinct constitutional, legal, institutional identity must take precedence. Now, Fallou did not live to see it because he died in 1712, but the War of the Spanish Succession ended with the confirmation of Philip as King of Spain and the punitive imposition of Castilian law on Catalonia and other parts of the monarchy, while systematic trade reforms were only introduced in the second half of the 18th century, so decades later. In many ways, the path followed by the Hispanic monarchy after the War of Succession was the opposite of what Fallou and his collaborators would have found desirable. But rather than presenting us with a lost cause, I think this outcome reminds us of the humbling powers of historical contingency. And on a less fatalistic note, it draws attention to the richness of options to combine constitutional and commercial, identitarian and economic matters that could speak to the present day. One might recall the difficulties and the interesting choices that pro-independence forces in Catalonia made, or in Scotland for that matter, when they had to engage with the question of the economic viability of independence. And perhaps to end on a positive note here, we might also be reminded, amidst all the dilemmas of unification and separation in the world, that parallel or even overlapping loyalties are not necessarily and conceptually competing and antagonistic loyalties. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists, and I invite now our participants to begin putting in any questions that you have into the Q&A chat box that you hopefully should be able to access. We have about 15-20 minutes to have a little discussion and answer a few questions. Over to the panelists really to jump in and contribute any points or ask any questions of each other as well. I think what struck me as I was listening to your presentations there was that you've obviously all described unions, political unions that have been under strain in their various geographies and historical contexts. And I suppose one of the big overarching questions is, to what extent have those strains kind of reflected structural flaws in the various constitutional arrangements versus the more contingent external shocks or internal kind of political choices? So I suppose that's my big question to start us off. And I don't know who wants to take it first, but I mean, one that comes to mind with Lisa's presentation in particular is that we've looked at this idea of unionists in Northern Ireland feeling betrayed as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol, but yet, I suppose a kind of pro-unionist stance could suggest, well, is this showing us that actually the UK has a very surprisingly resilient, flexible constitution, that even in that scenario you're concluding that there's going to be a continuance of the kind of status quo, or should the interpretation be different, that actually there are structural weaknesses that in the UK constitution that Brexit has thrown up? So maybe to Lisa first then.
Excellent question. So I guess I would answer in two ways. I think theoretically, there is absolutely a strong, and there has been a strong unionist case to be made in favour of Northern Ireland's post-Brexit position, that underlines the flexibility of the UK constitution and the fact that this protocol arrangement isn't a constitutional threat, and it's been challenged right up to the Supreme Court. Didn't get time to get into, but the nuances of that case are really interesting in how the union itself was defined, characterized, and understood. And ultimately, it was concluded that the act of union and the union itself hadn't been fundamentally undermined or changed as a consequence of the implementation of the protocol. That said, and it's sort of separating, I guess, the constitutional position and the flexibility of the UK Union as a constitutional union from the political identity and the sort of the reified, the necessity for political unionism in Northern Ireland to identify as this, and it's no surrender. That's its sort of historical tagline, this sense that they will not give an inch towards any sort of change without unionist consent. And so I think that's where you're seeing the tension, really, the friction comes within unionism in Northern Ireland, is that political identity and the importance of portraying that solidity of that identity and the fact that it's not a threat with the realities of a changing state that they're in. And it's a hard political line to walk. Ultimately, I think we're at a point now where, because of the necessity for continuing government in Northern Ireland, there maybe isn't political benefit for unionism in the short term to sort of upend the boat again, which is why I concluded with a sense of status quo, a bit moderate. But that doesn't suggest. I'll let others jump in here in their perspectives. But
yeah, I mean, what about in Germany, Caroline? If you had to kind of say in general, do you think that are the problems structural, or these are more kind of contingent issues, or very kind of a mix of both? I suppose you spoke a lot about the kind of legacy of unification and how the East was expected, as I understand it, to almost sign up wholesale to these existing constitutional arrangements. So how much are the strains about the kind of structural issues in that, or is it more about the issues you spoke about in terms of the economic crises and the rise of the far right?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to disentangle, Jack. It's a good question, but I think the biggest debate today about union in the German context is all to do with, could it have been done better when the system was unified? And the structural issues obviously were designed at a certain moment in Germany's history. So on the basis of the context at that time, it's been a question over those 35 years of trying to make it work. But the structural context sort of defined the economic path that happened subsequently as well. And you kind of have to unpack the decisions that were being made in the context on the availability of evidence at the time. And there's a kind of generational story, because the leaders of West Germany and Helmut Kohl in particular really emphasized having parity. He was sort of normatively committed to this. He was born in the post-war era. He'd been socialized at a time when Germany was wrongly, in his eyes, divided into a communist part and a Western liberal democracy. In the Western part, the view was very much that needed to change. It needed to be reunited. So he was paying tribute to that kind of ideology. It was his moral duty to legitimately integrate these two on a sort of equal basis, even though the German economy in the eastern part of the country was fundamentally weak at the time. He insisted that there needed to be one-to-one parity for the currency. So Eastern German marks and Western German marks had to be exchanged at 1-to-1, even though on the currency markets it was like 7-to-1. So there's a massive discrepancy. It eradicated any opportunity for Eastern German workers, maybe not businesses, but workers, to offer some kind of wage competition. So to encourage and incentivize Western businesses to locate in the East and offer jobs, because they could obviously pay at a lower cost, and it would incentivize, job creation and economic growth at that level. It just couldn't happen because of this kind of normative commitment to equality and to parity. So the structural flaws were inbuilt at that time, but you have to understand, I think, that was in the context of the historical moment at which the country found itself. So the decisions were being made with, you know, a particular sense of moral history weighing on their shoulders as well. I'll leave it there.
You shed any light on the question from the early modern Spanish context, Barnabas?
Well, I mean, luckily we cannot think or talk about structural flows with that kind of constitutional system, because going back to look at who even designed that system would be a whole different endeavor. But I think, to your point, those who had some responsibility for trying to oversee how the whole of the monarchy was run and how that could be governed as some kind of a unit on the international geopolitical stage. I think there were some who would have argued that these distinct legal systems within the monarchy are definitely a structural fault in the system that they needed to remedy. For the longest time, they couldn't. The 17th century was certainly a period where there was this tension between the royal government and this sort of more particular interests in a way that were represented in the territorial provincial estates. For the Catalans, this would certainly not have meant any kind of a structural flaw. I think they were Catalan lawyers and the Catalan elites were immensely proud of this ancient constitutional system that didn't only delineate them from the parts of the Hispanic monarchy that were seen as more pliable to the central royal government's demands, but also just to sort of layer unions and disunions onto each other. The Principality of Catalonia was part of the Crown of Aragon within the Hispanic monarchy. So sort of the Eastern realms formed another unit within the monarchy, together with the kingdoms of Valencia, Aragon, and Mallorca. And even within this union within the union, the Catalans often made a point to distinguish themselves from these other kingdoms within this subunion, arguing that their own constitution, well, they of course wouldn't use the expression constitutional system, but let's go to constitutional environment, was based not on privileges and liberties granted by a ruler at some time before in history, like that was the case in Aragon or in Valencia, but that it was I guess the word that would be often used in historiography, it was a pacted system, a system of pactisme. So there was a contract between the Catalan political nation and the sovereign that contained rights and responsibilities for both parties, and that actually could be, so would have gone the Catalan argument, well, renegotiated if needed, but also just broken if the other party did not really keep to that. And one practical consequence of that in the 17th century was that after the 1640 rebellion of the Catalans, it was actually the Catalan estates decided that, okay, now we are going to change sovereign, and we're going to place ourselves, well, they tried to place themselves under the protectorate of Louis XIII of France, but eventually they had to sort of kind of elect him as Count of Barcelona. So for a bit over 10 years, that part of the Hispanic monarchy was, at least from the perspective of Catalan, not officially under French, or at least they shared the sovereign with the Kingdom of France. So that was the practical consequences. But to the Catalans, that was not a structural flaw. That was a a guarantee, sort of. I guess we could call it a constitutional guarantee in today's parlance.
Fantastic. The Hispanic monarchy sounds especially complex, and I don't envy you getting your head around it in your thesis. We have got a question through from our audience. It asks about economic interdependence and whether that seems to be a kind of common denominator in all of your cases. And I suppose you've all spoken about that, Carolyn, with the kind of fiscal transfers and almost subsidies from various states to others. Lisa obviously focusing on the protocol and its successors, and the moving of the customs border to the Irish Sea, and then Barnabas, the kind of protectionist commercial policies in the Hispanic.
No, have we lost our chair?
I'm not sure of the specific question, but I guess, should we ask, I mean, Barnabas, do you want to start off on the sense of what an economic union or economic relationships do for political unions?
I think the first thing that popped into my mind when it comes to this economics, how that's converted into political unions, is when there was this line of argumentation in the pro-independence, within the pro-independence movement in Catalonia in recent years, and let's say around 2014, that sort of just took economic data and tried to compare Catalonia as a unit to other countries. And basically the argument ended up being, well, Catalonia is kind of as big as Denmark and has as many people live in Catalonia as, I don't know what the specific example was. And then consequently, we don't actually need Spain, but the rest of it. It was kind of easy to see why that wouldn't work in real life. But I think if we climb back to the analogous discussions in the late 1600s, I mean, on the one hand, there was a clear sense that the Catalans, this commercially minded Catalans, would have loved to properly use this umbrella of the Spanish Empire to make their job easier and then make their trade more lucrative. And that's what they wanted. I think, on the other hand, they didn't really have to ask questions about independence in the same way as they could today, because they didn't belong in the same sense to the Hispanic monarchy as Catalonia belongs to the Kingdom of Spain today. I think this only came to a sort of a breaking point when the events were, when the War of Succession acted as a catalyst, because then the opinions kind of radicalized, and then I think there were, including this value, this character that I mentioned, some of them could have imagined even breaking up the Hispanic monarchy and let the Bourbons keep the western part. We are going to be fine because our first priority is to maintaining our constitutional order or national identity in an early modern sense. So in that way, I think that was a more flexible, or that allowed for a more flexible approach 300 years ago than it would now. If that makes sense at all.
It is a very live, if I may quickly, it's a very live question or issue in the context of post-Brexit Northern Ireland, because the sense that the protocol was affecting or growing out of a belief in an all-island economy was a really contentious issue, and they actually sort of took out that language from the ultimate legal text that got passed because of unionist discomfort with this idea of an all-island economy. We've actually just recently in the news in Northern Ireland locally seen the DUP opposing changing the model requirements around funding of North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland. The Irish government essentially wanted to give us free money, no strings attached, but the DUP have opposed that because of a discomfort with the idea of Irish government investing in the North and this sense of having increasing influence. So but that's very much putting it in the reality of a post-conflict society, which I would still define Northern Ireland as. It's a zero sum in terms of if there's more economic links to the South, then that's a threat to our economic position within the UK, within that sort of zero-sum binary, which in that instance of unionism is a real feature. But it's a great question.
Get to weigh in on the economic.
The backtrack. Shall I follow up just on that question? And I think that's really interesting, Lisa. But what do economic unions do for political unions? And I think I was reflecting just on what is the limit of union. At what point do you reach disunion, if there's like a spectrum? But certainly within the German context, the narrative has never been around disunion and blowing the whole thing apart. It's always been about constitutional reform. What can we do better? And the stronger you are economically, the more emboldened you are to feed into those conversations around constitutional restructuring. And I'm talking here about the 16 sub-state entities, the lenders that are working on this. So Bavaria is always the one that's held up as an example because it has the largest GDP and pays most into the fiscal transfer system. It has the biggest voice in pushing for federal reform. So looking to move away from cooperation to more competitive federalism, more autonomy, a clearer separation of authority and power, etc., and ability to retain more of your financial successes at the local level and spend that money autonomously. And I think there's echoes that you can see in other contexts as well. It's not difficult to follow the logic. Yeah, but I was just reflecting on the disunion element in this conversation and where the limits are, etc., and what's an alternative to disunion. And certainly for the German context, it's been about drilling into that constitution and looking to improve it in line with the dominant thinking in and amongst the players in the game.
Fantastic. Well, it just about brings us up to 7 o'clock there. Apologies for dropping off my Wi-Fi. Almost survived the entirety of the hour and a half. But thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Lisa, to Barnabas, and to Carolyn. Thank you very much to our audience members as well. This video will be up on our Centre for Geopolitics YouTube, hopefully within the next week or so. And please do look out for other Centre for Geopolitics events on our website. With that, all that's left to say is another thank you very much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.